Read Genesis, and you start with a panoramic view of human origins. You get the creation of the world, the flood, and the genealogy of humanity. But right at chapter 11, the story slams into a narrative choke point. The focus aggressively zooms in to zero in on one man from Mesopotamia. This timeline charts that structural pivot. In Genesis 10 and 11, the text documents the dispersion of humanity, listing the origins of exactly 70 global nations. Then, those 70 nations vanish from the primary storyline, replaced by a single, narrow line tracking Abram. The standard explanation for this pivot relies on the Tower of Babel. Humans tried to build a tower to the heavens. God confused their languages as punishment, and they scattered. Following that scattering, the text introduces Abram, living here in Ur of the Chaldeans, a massive urban center in ancient Mesopotamia. But God doesn't zoom in on Abram's family simply to start a new historical record. The math of the text, the sudden drop from 70 distinct nations down to an isolated man in Ur, points to a specific, high-stakes celestial conflict. To understand it, we have to look closely at the legal mechanics of what actually happened at Babel. Our English Bibles base their Old Testament translations primarily on the Masoretic text, standardized in the Middle Ages. But to map the legal fallout of Babel, we need the oldest available records. We find those in the Qumran caves, home to the Dead Sea Scrolls. This specific fragment, known as 4Q Dut J, preserves a much older reading of a crucial verse, Deuteronomy 32, verse 8. Let's look at the textual variants for this verse. It describes how God divided the nations at Babel. The medieval Masoretic text reads, "He set the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of Israel." There is a glaring historical problem here. At the time of the Babel dispersion, Israel did not exist. Abraham hadn't even been called yet. But look at the older manuscripts in the second and third columns. The Greek Septuagint translates the phrase as angels of God, and the oldest Hebrew text from the Dead Sea Scrolls reads B'nai Elohim, the sons of God. He set the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. In the political structure of the ancient world, a high king assigning territories to subordinates was a formal transfer of jurisdiction. By dividing the nations according to the sons of God, members of his divine council, the Creator was stepping back from direct administration. God effectively told the rebellious human race that they would get exactly what they wanted, a world without his direct oversight. He signed away the 70 nations, delegating them to the administration of lesser divine beings. This creates what scholars call the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. Here is the mechanical map of that separation. The earth is split into exactly 70 distinct territories, matching the Genesis 10 table of nations. Each of these 70 nodes is legally delegated upward, placed under the jurisdiction of a secondary, hovering administrative layer, the sons of God, or the divine council. To see how this ancient structure functioned in practice, we can look to the Ethiopian Orthodox canon. Their biblical tradition, specifically texts like the Book of Jubilees and 1st Enoch, preserves detailed records of these territorial entities. Jubilees chapter 15 explicitly states that God placed spirits, often called Mela'ect or watchers in the Ge'ez language, over all the nations to lead them away from him. These ancient descriptions of regional deities reflect a highly organized spiritual hierarchy. The nations were no longer under the direct care of the Creator, but under a corrupt bureaucracy that demanded their worship. Which brings us back to the abrupt pivot between Genesis 11 and 12. If God has just legally signed away all 70 human nations to other spiritual entities, he cannot simply select one of them to enact his rescue plan. They are already spoken for. This explains the biological conditions of Abraham and Sarah. Sarah is entirely barren. The nation of Israel cannot develop naturally from the existing human stock. It has to be created out of nothing. It requires a direct, supernatural intervention by Yahweh to forge a brand new nation. This diagram illustrates what happens next. Deuteronomy 32:9 states, "But the Lord's portion is his people." The Hebrew word is chelek, meaning an allotted portion. God creates one new node, Abraham, and draws a direct, unmediated line straight to himself, entirely bypassing the divine council layer. Israel becomes the only unmediated territory on earth. This framework clarifies God's promise to Abraham in Genesis 12. In you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. That promise is a declaration of strategic warfare. God establishes a beachhead in hostile territory. The Abrahamic covenant is the long-term plan, designed to eventually reclaim the 70 nations from the lesser gods. As the Old Testament progresses, this strategy transitions into a formal legal proceeding in the heavenly realm. We see the indictment in Psalm 82. The psalm opens with God standing in the Adat El, the divine assembly. He directly addresses the delegated Elohim ruling the nations, and he charges them with a crime. They have ruled unjustly, failed to protect the weak, and demanded worship for themselves. God then issues a lethal sentence against these spiritual beings. He says, I said, you are gods. Nevertheless, like men you shall die. He legally revokes their immortality and their authority. The entire narrative arc of the Old Testament operates in the shadow of this divine trial. The delegated administrators have been found guilty, and the stage is set for a final repossession of the earth. To see how that repossession is executed, we have to read the book of Revelation. When viewed through the lens of Babel and Abraham, Revelation functions as the final legal settlement of the conflict that began at Babel. In chapters 4 and 5, the narrative enters the heavenly throne room. The central object of tension is a sealed scroll. In Roman and Near Eastern law, a document with 7 seals was the standard legal requirement for the transfer of property. This scroll represents the legal title deed to the earth. When Christ steps forward to take the scroll, he is acting on the Abrahamic covenant. By claiming the title deed, he legally revokes the Babel delegation and triggers the repossession of the nations. This legal action initiates the judgments that follow. They culminate in the fall of Babylon in Revelation 17 and 18. In this context, Babylon represents the spiritual architecture of human rebellion that gathered at the tower. Its destruction marks the total collapse of the system that held the nations captive. The judgments of Revelation are the active execution of the sentence passed in Psalm 82. The sons of God are finally stripped of their territorial authority. This reclamation project officially launched at Pentecost in Acts chapter 2. God poured out his Spirit, using the gift of tongues, the exact mechanism used at Babel, to begin reintegrating the world back into his family. By the final chapters of Revelation, the reversal is absolute. The text describes the New Jerusalem using highly specific symbols. The sea, the ancient symbol of chaos and rebellious nations, is gone, and the leaves of the magnificent tree of life are explicitly meant for the ultimate healing of the nations. The city's gates remain open, and the nations walk in its light. This final map shows the result. The bureaucratic layer of the divine council dissolves. God takes the unmediated relationship established with Abraham and multiplies that direct connection to every nation on earth. The Abrahamic covenant was the calculated, long-game mechanism God used to dismantle a corrupt spiritual bureaucracy, end humanity's long exile, and resume